The Denver Broncos may not be far off from naming Bo Nix their starting quarterback. Bo was taking reps with the ones again at day 10 of Denver Broncos training camp. We're going to talk about that, as well as some young pass rushers stepping up and more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos.
You are Locked On Broncos, your daily Denver Broncos podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome into another episode of Locked On Broncos. We're going to be breaking down Bo Nix, the reps that he took with the starting offense once again at Saturday's practice, day 10 of Denver Broncos training camp. Did a little bit of splitting reps with Jarrett Stidham. We're going to break down what that rotation could mean, as well as talking about some young pass rushers stepping up, young pass catchers stepping up, and maybe some kick return updates for this Denver Broncos roster. But I want to say thank you to every single one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. My name is Sayre Bedinger, co-host here at Locked On Broncos, typically alongside Cody Roark, who is the beat reporter over there at Mile High Sports in Denver. Cody's still finishing up his move as we're here in the midst of training camp. But fear not, Broncos Country. He sent me his notes from practice, and he's excited to get back on the saddle here with the show. And if you haven't already, we appreciate you so much for subscribing to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, or if you haven't done so yet, go over to YouTube, hit subscribe over there, where we're on the road to 15,000 subscribers. And Broncos Country, today's episode of the show is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. And we're on the doorstep of the NFL season, right? This summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus every single day. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Broncos Country, we got to talk about Bo Nix, not just stacking strong days together, which he continued to do at day 10 of Broncos training camp, but also, you know what? He's taken a lot of reps with the starting offense throughout the course of this week. So let's break this down really quick before we get into the nitty gritty, the details of the practice itself. So far this week, and it'll end this way, the Broncos had 6 practices. They practiced Monday through Saturday. Among those 6 practices, Nix ran with the starters in 4 of the 6 practices, okay? The Broncos had 5 padded practices, which is notable because Bo Nix was running with the number 1 unit in 4 of the 5 padded practices. So I think you can kind of read into that what you will. It seems like Nix is everything the Broncos anticipated. They aren't necessarily bringing him along slowly. He's been out there running everything for this team, situationally, changing plays at the line of scrimmage, calling audibles, all these sorts of things. He looks comfortable out there, especially from the people that I'm talking to that are at practice watching it unfold, namely Cody Roark, who will be able to sound off on this as soon as he's back. But according to Cody out there, Nix had another strong day. Okay. So the way that things were broken down, the very first team period of practice, which is really where you want to start kind of paying attention to who the number 1 quarterback is. Jarrett Stidham was the first quarterback out there in the first team period, as well as the very last one where they were working an end of game situation. In between, was all Bo Nix. So Nix had a big play to Cortland Sutton on a crosser for a good gain, a big play to Lucas Krull for 15 plus yards, nearly had another big throw to tight end Greg Dulcich, but unfortunately Dulcich dropped the pass, and he had a touchdown pass to Cortland Sutton in scramble drill during red zone work. So the Broncos' young quarterback continues to make strides. Sean Payton, after practice, even noted that there's aspects. Once again, I know you don't like to kind of necessarily put these guys in the same breath because Drew Brees is a Hall of Famer. Bo Nix is a rookie that has yet to even step on the field for a preseason game. But when you talk about traits, when you talk about the things that make Bo Nix a special quarterback, one of the top primary things that compares to Drew Brees, according to Sean Payton, after practice, this is what he said. He said that Drew had an innate feel for getting rid of the ball and making sure that he didn't take unnecessary sacks. And Peyton kind of went on a little bit of a tangent talking about how quarterbacks are they're really responsible for a lot of sacks in today's NFL. That's more, he said, more so a quarterback stat than an offensive line stat a lot of the time. And Bo Nix he's excellent at avoiding pressure and getting rid of the ball. And Sean Payton highlighted that as something that he's noticing is similar between Bo Nix and Drew Brees, which is worth noting because, man, you would expect a head coach to be like, you know what, we're not going to necessarily talk about those guys in the same sentence right now or the same breath right now. He's got a long way to go. There's this, it's not necessarily a hyperbole situation from Sean Payton, if I can say it that way. It's really more so of you can tell he's excited and you can tell that he's trying to kind of just diminish it as much as he possibly can. But I think Sean knows he's got a good one in Bo Nix. But what about Jarrett Stidham? Right, because Stidham did get the very first team series of the day. He was behind Nix for the majority of the rest of practice when they would go out for team drills. Stidham had a nice throw deep downfield to Troy Franklin. According to everybody that I saw that was out at practice, this was a perfectly placed throw deep downfield, and unfortunately, the ball was just dropped by Troy Franklin. And Franklin, we'll talk about him more later, but sounded like he got open a few times on the day, cashed in on a couple, and was unfortunately not able to reel this one in. Stidham also had a big play of 15 plus yards on a slant pattern to Josh Reynolds, and he converted late in practice a 4th and 18 to Marvin Mims, which it started off, the situation was with 50 plus seconds to go. Broncos down by 6, got a score. It doesn't sound like any of the quarterbacks were able to push the ball into the end zone during this particular period, but Jarrett Stidham, after taking a sack and then potentially getting sacked a second time in a row, on misses a 3rd down pass on 4th and 18, he goes up to Marvin Mims, and you know that Marvin is going to be able to get open deep, and he's going to be able to create that separation. So you trust Mims when you're chucking the ball downfield, and it sounds like Stidham has that figured out. But it really feels like Bo Nix is creating that level of separation in this quarterback competition to where we may see, I know I said earlier in the week that kind of my timeline for this has been before the Green Bay preseason game, which is week 2 of the preseason. I can't help but wonder, after what we saw this week at practice, could Sean Payton and the Denver Broncos actually name Bo Nix their starting quarterback before they take on the Indianapolis Colts in week 1 of the preseason? That would not surprise me at all. Now, what we're going to have to wait and see is whether or not he kind of switches things for this coming week of practice, because there's always a chance that they could come out. The Broncos don't necessarily have 6 full practices like they did this previous week. It's a little bit different when you're preparing for a game, but it's going to be fascinating to see how many padded practices this coming week does Jarrett Stidham get, and does he kind of prepare this week as the starter, quote unquote, for that Indianapolis game. I think there's a chance of that, but the way things are trending right now, after we've seen Bo Nix take 4 of the first 5 padded practices, getting reps with the ones and taking the first team reps a majority of the time, I wouldn't be surprised if we end up seeing him being named quarterback 1 a little bit sooner than I was even thinking just yesterday when we're talking about this on the show. So as I've been looking through Cody's practice notes, it really seems like Nix has a great command of the offense. He's spreading the ball around to different players. He's able to adjust and call audibles at the line of scrimmage. He has a command of the offense. We talked about how significant it is what PJ Locke said about him the other day this week, when PJ was talking about how Nix is kind of playing mind games with the safeties on this Denver Broncos roster and really giving them tough looks by manipulating them with his eyes. He's looking the safeties off. He's doing all these things in practice, very atypical of what we've seen from Denver Broncos quarterbacks in recent years. A lot of throws over the middle of the field, and you see Broncos Country on Twitter kind of making jokes about the middle of the field. What's that? Obviously an allusion to Russell Wilson last year, but look, there's a lot of things that are going to be different about this quarterback position that could lead to it being an upgraded position. Even though you had Russell Wilson, a 10-plus year veteran, he threw 26 touchdowns last year. We saw him use the wheels a little bit more last year. There are plenty of aspects of the quarterback position right now that could actually be upgraded in Denver in 2024. But of course, as always, we are going to have to wait and see until we get to the on-field stuff during actual games. Even just a preseason game would be a gift from the football gods right now. We cannot wait to see these guys out there in action, in game situations, and actually being able to kind of formulate our own opinions from those of us who can't see every single rep at practice. But Broncos country, those who can see every rep at practice are noting there's some young pass rushers standing out for this team. Namely, we're seeing guys like Thomas Incoom and Dondre Tillman making an impact at practice now that the pads have come on. We're going to talk about those two young pass rushers and why you should be keeping your eyes peeled for them in the 2024 preseason here on today's episode, Locked on Broncos. Today's episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, patience. The formula for winning championships is also what keeps your ride or die alive. And eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. And with over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. And with all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home huge wins. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit. Only available to U.S. customers. The Denver Broncos have some young pass rushers that are standing out now that the pads have come on at practice. We're going to talk a little bit about Dondre Tillman and Thomas Incoom, a couple of pass rushers who could be preseason superstars for the Denver Broncos, but want to say thank you to each and every one of you that makes Locked On Broncos your first listen of the day every single day. And we appreciate those of you that are locked in to Locked On Broncos. If you haven't already, hit subscribe on your favorite podcast platform or over there on YouTube, or do both if you haven't already done so. But we appreciate you so much, Broncos country, for making us part of your day. And if you want to check out something for your second listen, check out Locked On NFL. Let's talk about these two young pass rushers that are standing out for the Denver Broncos, Thomas Incoom and Dondre Tillman. Let's start off by talking a little bit about Dondre Tillman. His name keeps on popping up. He had multiple sacks in Saturday's practice, according to our own Cody Roark, who was there in attendance and watching things. And this is not the first time that Tillman has popped up in Cody's practice notes. I find this to be one of the most fascinating players on the 90-man roster as we enter into the preseason. Why? Because the Broncos signed Dondre Tillman, if you didn't know, out of the UFL, where he was one of the best defensive players in the league over the last 3 seasons. He can rush the passer. He can bend around the edge. He can play a versatile role on the defensive line if need be. And what I find fascinating about him is there aren't any other outside linebackers on the Denver Broncos roster that are 270 pounds. I mean, this guy's kind of a throwback when you talk about outside linebackers. Kind of reminds me of the old Patriots and Pittsburgh Steelers defenses, those traditional 3-4 fronts where you're kind of taking just a straight up defensive end and dropping him back to the outside linebacker spot. Tillman has that kind of size, but he's quick off the snap. If you watch him play any in the UFL for the Birmingham Stallions, he was pretty quick off the snap and made a lot of plays behind the line of scrimmage. And so the Broncos, obviously, they're expecting quite a bit out of him based on the fact they gave him a 3-year contract. I mean, you don't typically see guys that are coming from other professional leagues getting 3-year contracts, right? This really more so reminds me of, remember the Alexander Johnson situation a few years back, where I know his off-field situation was completely different than Dondre Tillman coming up from the UFL. But Alexander Johnson, similar, he was out of football for a couple of years, and the Broncos signed him to a multi-year contract after he hadn't played for anyone. He hadn't done it. They're basically going off their scouting report from what they saw from him a couple of years prior at Tennessee. At least with Dondre Tillman, you have somebody that, okay, the scouting report is fresh. He's been playing professional football at a high level over the last couple of years. And he was expected, I think, to probably come into training camp with fresh legs. And really, he's in game shape right now. So I expected Dondre Tillman to stand out based on that and based on the fact that he's climbing up from the bottom of the depth chart. Really, really intrigued by this player and the fact that the Broncos gave him a 3-year deal. The fact that he's out there making plays at training camp, rushing the passer. Cody even notated that one of his sacks would have been a strip sack. If he's making plays like this now, let's get this guy into the preseason where you can actually hit the quarterback a little bit, right? And see what he can do. If he can go out there and start creating turnovers and start, just rushing the passer at a high level, creating by, tackles for loss, making plays behind the line of scrimmage. The more he does that, the better chance he's going to have at cracking this 53-man roster where I think he can play a versatile role. I think he can be listed as an outside linebacker and play some defensive line at 270 pounds. So we'll see what happens. But another player off the edge that's making an impact for the Broncos is second-year player Thomas Incoom. Thomas Incoom was a player the Broncos signed as an undrafted free agent, one of their top guys last offseason out of Central Michigan. Really, really talented athlete. I mean, big time on the RAS scale. If you don't know what the RAS scale is, relative athletic score, it's a scale out of 10. And Thomas Incoom is up there among the elite in terms of his RAS score. He's explosive. He's got size. He's got twitch. He's got all those things. But Sean Payton said earlier in training camp that Thomas Incoom he's kind of in that category of still developmental players, but the development, it's been impressive. I saw a tweet from Zach Stevens of DNVR the other day where he said that Thomas Incoom is basically out there good for a sack at least once every day. So Thomas Incoom continues to make plays at Denver Broncos training camp, and he's somebody that you should be kind of looking at for the back end of your roster and bookmarking these two guys, number 92, Dondre Tillman, number 53, Thomas Incoom, as players to watch in the preseason for the Denver Broncos, because these guys, when we talk about players that can really, they've got an opportunity to stand out in the preseason, pass rushers are always, always, always a focus. Why? Because the really talented pass rushers can get buried deep on a depth chart, and you're typically going up against offensive linemen that you can feast against, as well as quarterbacks that don't necessarily process as well. So you have an opportunity as a pass rusher to make a lot of splash plays in the preseason, typically. So I view that as a huge advantage for these two guys in terms of where the Broncos are at right now in keeping guys at the edge position on their roster. I think 4 spots are locked up between Baron Browning, Jonathan Cooper, Nick Bonito, and rookie Jonah Ellis. There could be a 5th spot available, maybe even a 6th, depending on if one of these guys can force the issue. We're fixing to find out, Broncos country, what these pass rushers bring to the table. A number of other players were standouts for good and bad at practice on day 10 of Broncos training camp. We've also got an injury update with cornerback Levi Wallace, who left the field of play with a hamstring issue, it sounds like. So some other day 10 news and notes, some positive, some negative, and we'll talk about that more on today's episode, Locked On Broncos. This episode of Locked On Broncos is brought to you by FanDuel. I love sports. I love sports so much. I never want them to stop. But you know what I do want to stop? The NFL offseason. And you know what? We're there, baby. We're there. The NFL offseason is almost over, and we've even got preseason games to look forward to. But during the offseason, sports, they're not sportsing the way that you want them to, right? But FanDuel lets me keep the sports going whenever I want. All I have to do is open the app and dream up bets anytime I'm in the mood. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. And you know what you need to do, Broncos country, if you are the betting type, is go over there to FanDuel and check out some of the things that you might want to smash the over on this season. Maybe over plus 650, the Broncos having the worst record in the NFL this season. That might be a bet you want to make. Or maybe you want to say they're over 5.5 wins this season. You can go ahead, head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Veteran cornerback Levi Wallace left the practice field with an apparent hamstring injury at Denver Broncos training camp. And unfortunately, he wasn't the only one not out there on the practice field for the Broncos. We're going to talk about some news and notes from players that just maybe, were good and bad on the day for the Denver Broncos at practice, including rookie wide receiver Troy Franklin. Troy Franklin giveth, Troy Franklin taketh. That's kind of the headline that I have here from practice on day 10. Sounded like Franklin dropped a possible big play early on in practice from Jarrett Stidham, which I alluded to earlier, but then had a 30-plus yard play from Zach Wilson a little bit later and got open for what would have been another big play, but the quarterback just couldn't find him deep downfield. Broncos fans, we're going to have to be patient with the explosive rookie out of Oregon. There are aspects of Troy Franklin's game that are electrifying, but he's not just going to be able to step into the same exact role in Denver that he had at Oregon, right? And we love the chemistry between Troy Franklin and Bo Nix. You love the connection that they've already built at college, but at the same time, it's tough to get from college to the NFL, really at all positions, but maybe especially so at wide receiver. So Troy Franklin's going to require patience, but I do think he's still going to be able to contribute big plays to this Denver Broncos team throughout the season, and certainly is going to keep defenses honest. Another primary area of focus that was a huge talking point throughout the course of this offseason, the kickoff return situation in the NFL. We all know the rules are changing, but as we saw in the Hall of Fame game, what are those rules really changing to? I love that ESPN during the Hall of Fame game kind of put that green box out there to let us know what the new landing zone is for kickoffs and kickoff returns and things like that. Sean Payton talked a ton about the new kickoff rules after practice on Saturday and how he likes it. He likes the ability that you may have to kind of take advantage of these things, but there's so many different starting points that it could be a little bit confusing for the fans watching at first. But fans aren't going to be confused if teams are, or if players are just taking off with the football and making big plays as kickoff returners. According to Zach Seegers of the Let's Talk Broncos podcast over there, he said that Tremont Smith and Jaleel McLaughlin were working with the top kickoff return unit and not Marvin Mims. Now, the Broncos know what Marvin Mims brings to the table as a kickoff returner. It makes sense that they would want to see other guys back there during practice, and I think we will eventually see Marvin back there, but this is something that we've talked about throughout the offseason. Is Marvin Mims going to continue returning kicks with an increased role in the offense? I think we kind of have our answer here that he may kind of take a little bit of a back seat depending on how teams play this. You're typically going to see two returners back there because of what can happen if you kick the ball in the landing zone and it goes into the end zone. So if the ball lands in the landing zone and goes into the end zone, the starting point for the offense's drive is the 20-yard line. So you want to have two returners back there to make sure that the ball doesn't hit the landing zone and then go into the end zone. Otherwise, you have the worst possible field position that you can have. So Tremont Smith, he has been a dynamic return specialist in the past. Jaleel McLaughlin, we know he's dynamic in space with the ball in his hands, and he's also one of the fastest players that the Denver Broncos have. I like the combination of those two guys back there, and I can't wait to see how they deploy these players in preseason games. This will be a must-see play throughout the course of preseason for the Denver Broncos to be able to notate, okay, who's out there, who's giving this team the best possible field position, who's catching the ball well because they might have to catch it on a hop a number of times. This is going to be one of the key areas of the entire rest of the offseason because of how big of a play this could end up being in terms of starting field position, in terms of creating big plays, just that could swing the momentum in a game. And the Broncos feel like they are going to be able to do really well with these new rules. Who's going to be the ones back there taking these kicks back? I cannot wait to find out, but it sounds like Tremont Smith, the corner, and Jaleel McLaughlin, the running back, are two names to pay attention to, as well as wide receiver Philip Dorsett, who got some work back there as well. Another standout from day 10 of Denver Broncos training camp, Audric Estime, the rookie running back. And Estime is one of those guys that the hype train is rolling. The hype train is rolling for good reason, because Audric Estime has size, he's got burst, he's got vision, he's an absolute freight train out there in space. This is a guy that defensive backs are not going to want to see in the open field. Again, I've brought this up a number of times, but it's worth repeating because it's such a significant number. Audric Estime had over 900 yards after contact last year. He had the fewest negative runs of any running back in all of college football. You put those two things together, and you've got a guy that is going to be able to come into the NFL and translate right away. He's a punisher at the position. He breaks tackles, and he creates when he's out there in space, not just in terms of bowling people over, but he's a little bit shiftier than he's given credit for. So Audric Estime continues to stand out at Denver Broncos training camp. Very, very exciting update there. Unfortunately, there is the downside of practice at times. When you have a lot of big plays being made downfield in the passing game, there are players that are going to be maybe standing out in a negative way. Cody noted in his notes here that at one point, Damari Mathis was called for pass interference during practice. There was a situation at one point where Greg Dulcich kind of burned Riley Moss for a play, and Moss was out of position a couple of times. So there's some young corners out here. After Levi Wallace left the field, I think that those young corners kind of stood out in a bit more of a negative way. But of course, these guys are young and they're still out there. They're making plays. We've noted that Mathis and Moss have both had pretty strong training camps thus far. So maybe a little bit of a down day for those two guys, but can't wait to see both of them in the preseason and how they do with extensive action in game reps. Injury wise, Levi Wallace did leave the field with a hamstring injury. Timetable at this point is not known. He'll be looked at for further testing. Other players that didn't practice on Saturday, Nick Bonito with the back injury. We've mentioned that before. Ronnie Perkins, Justin Sternad, Brandon Jones, and Zach Allen. So all defensive players that were not participating, but none of those players seems to be on a extended absence. Even Brandon Jones should be back within the next week and a half. So I don't think that there's anything to worry about there, Broncos country, but we'll obviously have to wait and see what happens with the situation surrounding veteran cornerback Levi Wallace. And Broncos country, the team is going to be off on Sunday as they get ready for another week of practice, which what are we going to see at the quarterback position? Are we going to see Bo Nix out there more with the first team offense? Are we going to see more Jarrett Stidham action? What are we going to see as the Broncos prepare for the Indianapolis Colts? Cody and I can't wait to break that down on Monday's new episode, Locked On Broncos.